Okay, welcome back everybody for this 11th, and I think this is the 11th video in this series on, could be 12th, I don't know, I've lost count at this point. Anyway, this is our series on the basics of economic regulation, and in this video we're going to be talking about a very controversial topic, and that is the valuation of life and other non-monetary benefits. Now, it needs to be said, right, that there are severe moral implications to the valuation of human life, and I'm not going to deny any of those. In this video, I'm speaking to you as an economist, right, and unfortunately, one of our functions as economists, and particularly as regulators, but in other areas of economics as well, is that we are forced to put values on human life, loss of human life, and damage to human life, so we need to have ways in which we do that, right, as a practical matter. Now, the other thing I'll say is that this is nothing new. Indeed, financial compensation for loss of life goes back at least thousands of years. Having said that cautionary note, let's hop into this. I think this is going to be a two-part video because we have a lot to say here, and it's going to take longer than the 20 minutes or so that I want to do. So please be on the lookout for that second part. So let's start to think about, what sort of method we might employ to determine the value of, say, the reduction in the loss of life. Let's say that there's a sporting event that occurs fairly regularly, and people get excited at this sporting event, and on average one person is killed at the sporting event each time it's held. Now, it's a very large event, and let us say that 10,000 people attend that event on average. Furthermore, we know that there are ways to avoid this, right? There are things that we can do to avoid this loss of life, but it isn't cheap to do. Okay, it isn't free. We can then employ a technique like this to determine sort of where the people attending the event stand on this issue. We could ask them, well, what if we were able to, so before we continue any further, right, so 10,000 people attend this event, one person on average dies at the event. So the likelihood of loss of life is 1 in 10,000. Okay. And so let's say we ask each of the 10,000 attendees, well, how much would you be willing to pay yourself, right, so that doesn't happen, right? So that this is as close to a risk-free event as we can do. Maybe they say, okay, well, we're willing to pay $5, per ticket, right? Okay, so that's, that adds to a certain amount. Like $5 per ticket would be 5 times 10,000 would be $50,000, right? And how much of a risk reduction are we getting for that? We're getting a reduction in loss of life of 1 in 10,000. Okay, so just to be clear, if we ask people at the event, how much are you willing to pay, and they say $5, right? Running that through this formula here, right, where the risk reduction in this case is 1 in 10,000, that means that our event goers, the people attending the sporting event, their willingness to pay for, their evaluation of that statistical life, right, of that hypothetical person losing their life is $50,000. It's quite, I think most of us would say that's quite low, right? But if we're asking people, well, how much would you pay, right? And they say $5. Okay, they say, well, what about 10? Because it's a person's life. And they say no. Okay, well, then we have some idea about where those people value that life. Okay, And that's one technique that we can sort of get at starting to think about this. There are a variety of other approaches that we can take to valuing human life or loss of life or damages to life. We can, for example, consider the present value of one's lifetime's earnings. So in other words, over a lifetime they would have earned a certain amount of money, and as a consequence, their life no longer is there. Maybe they have others that they would have supported, family, children, other relatives, and those people won't be able to receive that support. So there should be compensation, and so we're going to base that upon what the person would have earned, and that also has challenges, because of course somebody who earns a very modest income, of course, is going to be valued using that method significantly less than somebody with a better paying job, right? So there's ethical issues there too, and also there's some other additional complications, such as is it really the value of what their earnings lost, or also should we subtract off of that the balance of what they would have spent on themselves? Okay, it can be a fairly complicated question. Okay, conversely, what if 10 years from now they would have gone back to school and they would have earned more, right? Or they would have gained new skills at the workplace and earned more, or just gotten a big promotion and earned more. Okay, well then our calculation based upon their earnings today is going to be wrong. Okay, so it's a challenge. Implicit in what we've said so far is that everybody makes the same choices about where they work and what they do in their life, and that of course is not entirely accurate, right? People make different choices about the amount of risk that they take in their life, the type of jobs that they take, and the risk involved in the job. There are a number of differences across a large set of individuals that are likely to come into play that are going to affect some of these methods. For example, lost value of lifetime earnings, lost value of taxes. Of course, there are these heterogeneities in society too, which would also, so going back to our first scenario, if we asked people what is the life worth, the different audiences might very likely give us different answers as to what a life was worth. If we're a particularly risk adverse individual and we attend an event with a lot of risk loving people, they might place a very low value on our life relative to what we might place. And of course the reverse can also be true. And it's almost certainly going to be the case that different societies are going to place different values on life for a variety of reasons, some cultural and some economic. We have to understand that different people face different opportunities in life, and what sort of opportunities did an individual have, and then based upon those opportunities that were present to them, what choices did they make. So we have to understand that to each individual, the set of possible choices isn't necessarily the full set of choices that were available to all people, but the set of choices that were available to this individual or set of like individuals. Let's start to think about how we might incorporate some of those heterogeneities that I mentioned a short while ago into a model to build a more sophisticated forecast of lifetime earnings. Okay, so the heterogeneity specifically, that people may choose different type of jobs, different types of risk trade-offs in their lives. How we might build that. We might think about building that into a model. Okay, so let's consider the following two here, right? So these represent two different workers, okay, EU1 and EU1 and EU2. On the horizontal axis, we're measuring risk, and on the vertical axis, we're measuring wages. Each of these functions is representing what we believe to be the trade-off for a given worker between wage and risk. Now we'll note that these are both upward sloping, indicating that both of these workers are what we would call risk adverse. That is to say, as risk rises, we're going to assume, as risk rises, we're going to assume that compensation also has to rise, giving these an upward slope. We've illustrated this here, so EU2, the second individual, has a greater preference for a risk-free environment, all things being considered, when compared to EU2. So what that means is that they're requiring a higher degree of compensation for any given level of risk when compared to these other set of workers or other individual of workers. Okay, and so when we're doing this analysis, we would want to attempt to ensure that we're identifying statistically distinct sets of individuals, and that we're only grouping together sets of individuals that are statistically indistinct. Okay, to try to get an accurate picture of what this risk-wage trade-off looks like for the worker or set of workers in question. Here we see this, over here, now we see this from the other side of the transaction, so from the firm side of the transaction, well, the firm and the industry, Again, we have risk and wages. We have two firms in this case, represented by these two iso-profit functions, MM and N. Okay, so each of these firms, let's start with MM, let's start with MM. Okay, this firm, it can reduce risk at its workplace. It can move to the left along this axis and maintain profits. But if it does that, it will need to lower wages. So if it invests in safety equipment, if it invests in worker training to minimize losses, if it cuts labor hours, because people tend to have accidents when they're sleepy, it's going to have to offer a lower wage. So we see these iso-profit functions taking on this sort of slope here, right? Essentially they're upward sloping, but they're bowed off to the upper left. Similarly, firm NN faces a trade-off between risk and wage. In generally speaking, the line here indicates that firm NN operates in a higher risk, higher wage environment, all things being equal. Okay, so this is just the firm that does things a little more risky, and as a consequence, they have to offer higher wages. Now, across the entire industry, we have the iso-profit VV. So we're recognizing that there are relatively riskless, low-wage firms within the industry and higher risk, higher wage environments within the industry. Okay, now this is all very abstract, and for that I apologize, right? That's how it sort of goes. So what might be an example of how this would sort of look in reality? Well, we have a great example of this, in fact, and that's serving on board a ship. Those ships are all rated. Okay, so ships are internationally rated based upon the quality of their construction, right, and the current status of their construction, as well as the quality of the various components within the ship. So they each have a rating system, right? And if you're going to serve as a sailor on one of those vessels, that rating system is available to you. So you know what type of vessel you're serving on. Are you serving on a vessel that is well maintained and is well stocked with quality equipment? Or are you serving on a vessel that's of questionable nature? Okay. And of course we would expect, and indeed all things being equal, it does play out this way, that on riskier vessels, right, higher wages have to be offered, right? And so looking at this situation here, this might be our sort of safe, well-maintained vessel that has a very low probability of sinking or having other severe problems while at sea. And this might be, a vessel that needs a little work, has some other problems, has to offer its sailors, a higher wage, all things being equal. This line here, VV, okay, is the envelope of trade-off between wages and risk across the entire industry. If we were tasked with valuing loss of life in these cases, we would want to make sure that sailors serving on these type of vessels are not necessarily comparable to sailors serving on these type of vessels, and vice versa. That these sailors here almost certainly have a higher personal value for loss of life than sailors do here, despite the fact that they're earning a lower wage. Okay, so simply looking at lost wages as a factor of compensation has problems. So for example, if we simply look at lost wages for a vessel lost at sea without incorporating these differences into our model, we're going to be overcompensating high-risk individuals. So individuals who serve on very risky ships are, if by misfortune the ship sinks and families need to be compensated, those ones who took the greater risks are going to be compensated to a greater degree. But of course, the individual, by serving on it, has indicated a relatively high preference for risk relative to wages. Okay, so understanding that we perhaps have distinct set of individuals within industries is important to consider. And this is how we might start thinking about that. How would, as an empirical matter, how would we do this? Again, we're looking for distinct categories. And so if it was something straightforward like shipping, we would be looking at individuals who are serving on similar vessels, similarly rated vessels, rather than looking across shipping in general. Okay, just quickly over here, this is where it all sort of comes together, right? So here we've got V, the industry relationship that we talked about before. Here we've got our two individuals, and then here we have the wage risk trade-off that each of them choose, right? So individual 1 here is choosing this tangency point, and individual Y is choosing this tangency point. Okay, so it's just illustrating the fact that we, within this industry, we have the potential for multiple distinct wage risk trade-offs. Let's think about a formal model for some of the heterogeneities across labor markets or industries that we might consider normalizing for in estimating losses. So here what we do is over here. So here we have sort of annual earnings, but then attached to those annual earnings are a variety. First of all, a risk within that category, but then also a host of personal characteristics and a host of job characteristics. Okay, and so what we're attempting to do in this is to control for variances that that are going to exist, right? So if we're looking at sort of losses as a result of loss of life, we need to look at both sort of personal choices in life, but also job characteristics. And so we want to make sure that we're controlling for all those variations that might exist across a diverse set of individuals, so that we're only comparing to like individuals in like jobs. Okay, and we may find that there are statistically consistent rather than distinct. Okay, statistically consistent jobs across different industries, right? So it may not, I'm not saying this is always going to be the case, but we may find that there are comparables across a wide variety of industries and across an unexpected set of individuals. And indeed, we may find that comparables within an industry or even a firm may be inappropriate based upon determinations of whether we have a statistically consistent set of observations or a statistically distinct set of observations, where sort of there's differences that we can show exist. All right, this isn't the end of lecture 11, but this is where we're going to cut it for this one. We'll see you again soon with part 2. We're going to be talking about some methods that we might employ when we don't have clear-cut data as to earnings, okay, in valuation of loss or damage to life. See you there.